If you haven't seen my most recent video, I've basically put out build guides for every single build I currently have on Maxroll for planners, and you can find all of those in my Discord link down below. For the builds that we currently have done, we got Bone Spirit, Corpse Explosion, Infinimus, Sever, Blight, Shadow Surfer, Pure Minions, and Shadow Minions. I will be working on both Bloodlance and Blood Surge, as well as Bone Spirit and maybe the Bone Spirit hybrid in a little bit, but that's not what you're here to learn about. No. What I realized was that I was taking a completely different approach to building out my Paragon boards walking into this season. Now, if you go look at any one of these build planners, you're going to see these 7, even 8 glyph setups, because it turns out doing anything more than a minimum investment on any glyph is basically a waste of time. Picking up any real sources of additive damage is also a complete waste of time. And pathing through these boards as efficiently as possible to only activate multipliers as well as defensive stats is absolutely the play moving forward until something drastically changes. Now, how do we come to this conclusion? I realized that while I could just explain to you what I'm doing, it's not really going to make a lot of sense because I think that there's still a pretty wide gap in an understanding of how to calculate how to make your build better. And I don't just mean like how to put big damage numbers on it, right? Like even in this one glyph where there's literally nowhere else for me to put additional points to get any benefits out of it, you might be like, oh, look at all that additive damage. Look at that. That's 154 crit damage. That's gotta mean something. When in reality nowadays, it basically means a drop in the bucket as far as actually increasing the power of your build is concerned. Because stats on gear have gotten ridiculous, but none of this really makes sense unless you know how to calculate what your damage increases actually are. And because the game doesn't do a great job at explaining this to the player, I think that there's still a pretty wide gap in understanding. 1, people still think that there are damage buckets at all when there just are not. 2, people think that multipliers go into one big bucket and then you get less out of them than you think that you should. 2, people think that when you increase your critical strike damage as a multiplier, it only increases the part of the damage you dealt to the target that was calculated from critical strike. I see a lot of weird misnomeric understandings of how this game works online. So what I actually want to start off with is teaching you how to calculate your damage. Now, I'm going to cut out a lot of the boring parts where I literally tabulate everything, but the reason why this is going to be so important moving forward is because of the vast changes to our gear strength through the aspects and tempering that we now have available to us. It turns out that you can temper on hundreds of additive damage onto your build, as well as get greater affixes and masterwork crit on things like intelligence, as well as skill ranks, which are all such huge total additions to our power that it's really only in adding on unique versions of multipliers where you can really eke out much benefit. But again, that doesn't really make sense until you see the impact that these stats have on your character. So let's go ahead and do a crash course in how to calculate your damage, or at the very least get a really good idea of how to do napkin math and mental math to figure out roughly what kind of benefit you get out of making one decision versus another decision. And hopefully this will lead you to being able to make your own builds, not necessarily have to copy every single thing that you see online, and be able to make more informed decisions, especially during the early game and progression points where you go like, hey, should I swap over to this piece of gear or this piece of gear? This one's got green arrows, but is it as important as this one? Let's go ahead and break down the basics of how to calculate your damage, where to find these numbers, and the reason why you should basically be mostly ignoring your character stats in game, because even though they're not technically lying, people still think that attack power somehow relates to how much damage you do, which is one of the most hilariously incorrect things that you can be using as a measurement of your character's build. So the first most important thing that you got to do is just figure out how to calculate your weapon damage. And that's got to be easy, right? The weapon literally has a DPS number on it. What if I told you that that DPS number means literally absolutely nothing? Like, I mean nothing. Like, it is not related to a single thing in this video game. It's not even representative of how many attacks that you can do per second. And it's also not representative of the damage that you will do with your skill. In fact, you should basically just ignore the damage per second value in its entirety, because it tells you nothing. What we need to look at is damage per hit. This is the actual weapon damage range. So for a two-handed scythe, what we do is 3,269 to 4,903 damage. And when we want to do damage calculations here, the easiest thing that you can do is just take the average of this number to have one single base number. Remember that there's a 50% damage range between the minimum and the maximum number. That's why sometimes you do an attack and it almost looks like it's doing half as much damage. It's because there's literally a 50% difference between the minimum amount of damage that you can do and the maximum amount of damage that you can do. But for our purposes, we're going to take the average. So to get the average for this, really simple. You just want to take the first number plus the second number and you divide it by 2. And what we get is 4,086 damage. We're going to input this as our weapon damage, 4,086. I'm also just going to make these numbers a little bit bigger so it'll be easier for people to read at home. But there we go. We now have this number, and this is going to be the base number that we then multiply everything else off of. That's why increasing your weapon's base damage, which is directly rated to its item power as well as its weapon type, is going to be the most important thing that you can possibly do. For a Necromancer, fun fact, the two-handed scythe has the highest base damage. Because it's slow, it's a 0.9 attacks per second weapon, which again is not how many attacks you can do per second. Don't use that as a measurement of anything. But because it has a slow base, which affects how long your animations take, they increased the damage that it does. You'll notice that this does significantly more damage than even a two-handed sword at the same item power. For our example right now, we're going to be using Bone Spirit. Bone Spirit is going to be a really good example of this because it has such naturally high multipliers for the skill itself, and it gets up to a really high rank on this character, so its base damage is very high. When you're reading this skill, you'll notice that it does 224% multiple of your base damage. If we were to say that a skill does 100% of our weapon damage, meaning we get the full value of it, that's doing its base damage, right? So if I were to take my base weapon damage here and multiply it by 100%, or multiplying it by 1, that's saying the same thing, what I would get is a skill damage of 4,086, the same number. We're getting 100% of our bonus. Let's use just another quick example because it's very easy to work in absolutes here, or rather to work in things that are 1-to-1. But let's say your skill only dealt 50% of your damage, or a 0.5 multiplier of your damage. This is the same thing as saying that it cuts your damage in 2 or divides it by 2, if that's easier for you to realize. But if we were to have a skill that only does 50% of our base weapon damage, that would instead deal 2,043 damage, because it's a 50% coefficient of our base damage. But how do we get to what our base damage number should be altered by to figure out what our skill damage is? Well, it's in the number itself. So the skill is saying that it does 224% of our base damage. If it was something like our rank 1 Bloodlance, it would only be doing 75 or 80% of its base damage. Here, we're doing 224%. So to get that down to a multiplier that we can actually use, we just divide it by 100. Because our skill says that we do 224, to get that down to a multiplier that we can actually use, since that is a percentage, right? That's 224% of it. How many times do you multiply it by? You just divide by 100. So in the case of doing 80% of your damage, that's a 0.8 multiplier. You're getting 80% of the function. Here we're getting 2.24 times of multiple. So we just go ahead and put that in as 2.24. You can always just take the number 224 and then divide it by 100, which would get you to the 2.24 if you want to continue to do the arithmetic long version, just so you can get to that number. But what we now have, if I were to have like a final damage number, right? Just like final damage number, what this would be our base damage number multiplied by our skill multiplier. Right now, with nothing else going on, we're now doing 9,000 damage. Great, that's really good to know. And we're going to continue to use this like basic understanding and simplification of all of our multipliers so that we never get caught up. We can always just follow this model of making sure that we are properly multiplying our multipliers to the base. Now, Bone Spirit is unique in the fact that it also gains a multiplier, a straight up multiplier, for how much essence we have when we cast Bone Spirit. Now, there is some really hard mental gymnastics that you need to do to create a properly working model of expected amount of essence you have on each cast. But that's basically impossible for me to create in a real world scenario because it's based off of every other stat that you have on your character. And it requires you to have a really powerfully like deep and innate understanding of your playstyle and what the expected outcomes are. For our purposes, we're going to assume that you have maximum essence when you cast Bone Spirit because you built your character good and you followed, at the very least, maybe a good build guide that teaches you how to effectively do this every single time. Shameless self-plug for the build guide that I'm using as this example. You should check it out. But for the purposes here, we need to figure out how much maximum essence we have in the first place, and that's going to be based off of all the other stats that we have on our gear. But luckily, over on the max roll planner, I could just scroll on down to utility down here, and you might not be able to see it behind my big head, but I have 187 maximum essence. Now, even this is slightly wrong because it's not currently calculating the bone graft bonus that we would have in combat, but let's go ahead and ignore that. I have 187 essence. Because Bone Spirit is interesting, I'll go ahead and insert a column to the left. This will be called Bone Spirit Multi. And this will just be based off of our essence. So again, to double check, I have 187 maximum essence, 187. And we know that the Bone Spirit skill is going to gain a 4% damage multiplier for each essence. So just to figure out what this number is, I'm going to go ahead and take this and multiply that bad boy by 4. So now we have a 748% damage multiplier. We're going to multiply our damage by 748%. Now, here's where it gets a little bit different than what you normally need to do. We need to take this number and add it to our base damage. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say we had no essence when we cast Bone Spirit at all. What that means is that we would normally just multiply this by 1, or we would do 100% of our expected damage. No bonuses here, nothing adding on to it, right? We would only expect to get the base damage of Bone Spirit if we could somehow cast it with no multiplier added to it. So to get up to what the actual multiplier is here, right? To actually figure out what 100% of our base damage plus this multiplier would be, we do the same thing that we did before. We take the big percentage number, we divide it by 100, and then we add that to 1. All right, we got that? So the reason why the skill damage is not getting 1 plus it is because we're actually doing a function of the base damage. In this is just like, how much of the base damage are we doing? Now we know that our base damage is a 100% value, and we need to add this multiplier to it. So to be able to do this, what we do is we do 1 plus the number that we're getting to, which I'm actually going to put in because I don't want it to be based off of a function here. I'm going to divide that by 100. So Bone Spirit's multiplier, when I have 187 base essence, is an 8.48 multiplier of our overall damage. That's why Bone Spirit does so much ding dang damage, is because it's a really, really high multiplier. Now to just follow again the example here, to be able to figure out what our damage is, we take our base damage, multiplied by one of our multipliers, multiplied by our other multiplier. The reason why we can just take all the multipliers and put them all together with the base number is because these multipliers are always existent. They will always work in this way. There's no conditions to be met. We always do a base skill damage difference here, and then we are always going to get the maximum bonus from Bone Spirit via its essence. When we take that all together, and all of a sudden, we're doing 5-digit damage here. We went from doing 9,000 damage up to 77,000 damage. Okay, number is still much lower than those like billion and trillion damage hits that you see online, right? Everybody loves watching Rob do roughly 14 quintillion damage, but you notice we're getting up into those multiple digits pretty fast here. Now we need to talk about our additive damage sources. Additive damage is the only bucket that exists anymore. Basically, when the game first came out, you had a critical strike damage bucket because any plus to critical strike damage that you had added to a multiplier. Any plus to vulnerable damage that you had added to a multiplier. Any plus to overpower damage that you had added to a multiplier. That's why the damage numbers were so high. And what they did was they made it so that if you successfully critically strike, you get a 50% damage bonus. And then any additive crit damage that you have goes into your additive bucket. The additive bucket is where all sources of additive damage go. This is where damage to close, damage to vulnerable, overpower damage, critical strike damage, damage to distant, damage to poison, damage to crowd control, damage to slowed, damage to stun, damage to burning. Anything that says damage to with a plus next to it is an additive damage. Damage to elites goes right in here. All damage goes in here. It's not a weird separate multiplier. It's just another additive damage, and it all goes into this one bucket. So to be able to calculate our additive damage, and we're not going to use the Paragon yet, because the whole point that I'm trying to make is how little additive damage bonuses in the Paragon tree matter. We're just going to take the additive damage from our gear. And when I mean additive damage from our gear, what do I mean here, right? Intelligence, that's not additive damage. Intelligence is its own multiplier. So I'm talking about Bone Spirit damage here. I'm talking about critical strike damage here, as well as additional Bone Spirit damage. Everywhere where we have anything that says plus a percentage of damage is going into this bucket. So I'm going to go ahead and just tabulate all of that for you real quick so you don't have to sit here and watch me do it in real time. We're going to use the power of editing. So looking at all of our gear that has additive damage on it, understanding that we're not even like always having greater affixes on it, which would drastically increase what that number is, or going as far as to like triple crit on a number, which also drastically increases how much of a benefit you get out of it. We are instead just going to make like reasonable expectations of the amount of additive damage that is especially inflated by how much you can temper on in season 4. And what we get is a total of 1300 additive damage. Now again, how do I get my 1300 additive damage into a multiplier that I can then multiply this damage by? Well, we're going to go ahead and follow the same rule here. We're going to take 1. We're going to add onto 1 this big old number 1309.6. And we're going to divide that bad boy by 100. And what we get is a 14 times multiplier of our damage. That's a pretty big multiplier of our damage. It's even bigger than the 4 times 187 damage that we get from our essence. The additive bucket tends to become a very large number very quickly because of the fact that everything falls into it. And now, interestingly enough, I didn't add in the additive of critical strike damage that I currently have here because I just want to show how that relates in your calculation. But if we assume that, and all of these numbers were basically just bone spirit additive damage, but if we were to assume that I were to cast bone spirit with this weapon at the base skill level that I have all my essence, and I only have the additive damage of just to plus bone spirit damage in this bucket right now, what that becomes is, drum roll please, this number multiplied by this number, multiplied by this number, multiplied by this number. And all of a sudden we're sitting at a whopping 1,094,000 damage. We just threw on a couple more factors of 10 there, and you can see how it's very quickly getting out of hand. But this is a good thing. You want to be able to get these numbers up this high. And if your build isn't getting your numbers up this high, you probably want to take a look at it and go, what am I doing wrong here? Now, you're not imagining it. I brought the intelligence multiplier over here because I realized that it didn't really make a lot of sense to put it all the way down there at the end, considering we had just touched on it. But what do I mean by your intelligence multiplier? Well, each class has a core stat, which is its main stat. For the Necromancer, that would be your intelligence. Your intelligence is going to do a couple things for people. It's going to increase your resistance to all elemental damage. But on top of that, for the Necromancer, it's going to increase our skill damage. And like I said, your intelligence is its own damage multiplier. To be able to calculate how much of a multiplier you get from your intelligence, you're going to take the number that you get for intelligence, divide it by 10, and that's going to get you to your increase of skill damage plus 201% of additional skill damage here. So we're going to take 1 plus this number divided by 100, right? So we can get down to an integer we can actually use for this multiplication. And we get another big multiplier here. So our intelligence is 201.9. Let me just double check that. 201.9. To be able to get to the number that we need here, this is going to be equal to 1 plus 201.9 divided by 100. And we get ourselves another 3 times damage multi here. Now, I could go ahead and show you the damage number. It's going to get us up to roughly 3 million damage, right? You don't have to go too far to be able to figure that one out. But you can see here why intelligence is such a powerful multiplier of our damage. It doesn't take a lot to get a lot. And since the only thing that feeds into this bucket, if that's the way that you want to think about it, is just our intelligence score, it basically means that every single time that we get 10 intelligence, we increase this multiplier by 1%. And that represents a certain amount of increase. And I think I'm going to go ahead and stop there and touch on this concept, because this is the thing that I see people misunderstanding as often as basically any of the other things. And it's a base understanding of how increasing a number is not increasing it by the amount that you think that it is. So let's go ahead and touch on that. So when we look at our intelligence, understanding how much we're increasing our overall damage by is different than understanding how much you're increasing this one multiplier by. Because the more multipliers that you add to a thing, the more dilute any one increase in them becomes, right? Like if I'm multiplying something by 15 different sources, increasing one of my multipliers by 50% is not going to just increase my overall damage by 50%, because there are so many things that's being multiplied by. The less of them that you have, the closer to true that becomes. The more of them that you have, the less true that becomes. But let's go ahead and look at just intelligence as this example. So by adding on this greater affixed 14% intelligence, we bump all the way up to 2,300 intelligence. That means that I have an increased skill damage multiplier here of 230%. I have added 30% additional damage to this multiplier. But I haven't increased this multiplier by 30%. I've added 30% damage to it, but I haven't increased its total number by 30%. How do we figure out that? So when you have a base number of 200, and we increase that up to 230, how much that 30 represents of the total number is your percentage in actual damage gained here. So to be able to calculate that, it's fairly simple. First, we have to get what the number was. So we're going to put this into a double bracket. We have to figure out what the increase is. So we take the new number minus the original number. I know you can do this arithmetic. I know it's 30, but just to show you what the equation looks like. And now we have to divide that increase by the original number. So why do we have to do that? Well, we have to multiply it by the original number to figure out how much of this is representative of that total number increase, right? So if I have $100 and I want to increase $100 by 20%, I just need to add on $20. It's really simple again when you're dealing with ones and zeros, right? When it's $200, I would have to increase that by $40 to increase the total by 20%, because 20% of 100 is 20. 2 times to the 100 to get to 200, I have to do 2 times the 20, and you get you up to 40, right? So the 30% here is not representative of a 30% increase in damage. It's actually representative of a 15% damage increase. That's what the 0.15 is showing right here. If you wanted to see it as a whole number, as a percentage, you just have to go ahead and toss on one more of these. And then you just, you multiply this by 100. That's how you take a percentage and get it up to a whole number. So it's a 15% damage increase. This is basically what the entire video is about. Once we figure out what our numbers are, when we add to these different multipliers, when I add into my additive bucket, when I add on to my critical additive damage, which will just add into my additive bucket, we're not just getting the number on the paper's increase in damage. We're getting percentage increases in damage because there's a number already there. So now that we have that understanding, and I kind of put the horse before the cart there because the rest of this is going to go on to continue to illustrate this thing. But if you walk away with a single important understanding of how to figure out what adding multipliers on and what increasing numbers does, you have to figure out what percentage of that number am I actually increasing by, comparing the new number I got versus the old number that I got. Let's go ahead and go down the line for the rest of the stuff here so we can finish out this example and we can get back to this overarching concept of how do I effectively increase these damage buckets. So for this build, we are going to assume that we have a 100% chance to crit. If you wanted to do the math yourself, we currently sit on a 45% chance to crit just from the stats on our gear. In addition to that, whenever you're casting a bone skill, obviously you're going to gain additional crit chance via serration, which is going to give you a certain amount of crit chance based off of how much essence you need. We don't actually need this, or even the number that we currently have here, to reach 100% chance to crit. But then on top of that, things like Bone Storm will give us a chance to crit once we have that active. Bone Spirit itself just has Swelling Curse, which just says you gain 25% chance to crit. And in addition to that, we also have Amulet of Grasping Veins, which give us another huge amount of critical strike chance once we successfully cast the skill. We don't even need to hit a target with it. We just need to cast Corpse Tendrils in general. And then lastly, the Bone Necromancer very specifically has a node in our Paragon tree, which actually gives us additional crit chance specifically with Bone. So we assume that we have 100% uptime on critical strike chance. So we can assume that we get 100% of the benefit of things like our critical strike additive damage. So when we say, did you crit here? What we're going to use this as a calculation for is to figure out how much of our additive bucket should be increased by the number that we have. So because we have 100% critical strike chance, or we have 100% uptime on crit, this might be a term that you hear people use, like uptime on vulnerable, uptime on overtower procs. uptime on critical strike, we have 100% chance to crit. That means that we gain 100% of the total critical strike additive bonus that we have to our additive bucket. How do we represent 100% in an integer that we can actually use for math? We divide it by 100 to get down to that number. You get a 1 value here. Now that we know that, let's go ahead and add our critical strike damage additive just from our gear to figure out how much our additive bucket is being increased by. Now, luckily, on the MacroBioBoi planner, you can also see how much your additive buckets are. And here's one of the first issues with why you can't believe what the character screen is telling you without understanding how the character screen is showing it to you. If you're to go look, we currently have 499% total critical strike damage bonus here. The issue being that it says that my ring gives me 108% additive critical strike damage. Let's go ahead and look at my ring. And you'll notice that my ring actually only gives me 72 additive critical strike damage. Why does this say 72 when my character screen says 108? Well, the fun fact about the character screen is that it takes your additive damage bonus and multiplies it by an additional 50%. Because if you were to successfully crit, you would gain a 50% multiplier of your damage. And here's why I wanted to very quickly point out to people why this is so very incorrect. Let's say you take a level 1 character and you successfully crit with no stats on your gear at all. How much do you think your damage is increased by? Do you think it's just 50% of all of your damage? Do you think that it's 50% of your 0 critical strike damage, meaning successfully critting with no stats on your gear would not increase your damage at all? No. Right? You could go do this right now. Go start a level 1 character, don't put any stats on them, get some average damage with your little base, scythe, be doing 10 damage per attack. And then when you crit, you should expect to do 15 damage. That's because critically striking doesn't only increase your critical strike damage on the character. It would be insane if it did that. It would do nothing until you had some critical strike damage, right? Successfully critting multiplies your damage by 1.5 and adds any additive crit that you have to your additive bucket. It's not only modifying your critical strike damage, it's not only modifying the part of your damage that was the critical strike and ignores your overpower or your vulnerable or your base damage. No, it doesn't do that. It just multiplies it by 1.5, then add your critical strike into your additive bucket. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll stop yapping about it. 72.5, 72.5. But I have 2 sources of 72.5 critical strike damage just on my gear. I also have it from the Paragon, but you can just kind of ignore that for right now. But to figure out how much additive damage I need to go add to my additive damage bucket, right? What I need to do is I need to put these numbers together. So 72.5 times 2 is a whopping 145. So this is 145 damage. But we know that we need to turn it into an integer because it's currently a percentage, right? So this is actually a 1.45 that we get added on to it. And to figure out our relative uptime, so if I only had 50% chance to crit, I should only assume that I get roughly 50% of this total bonus on my average damage. This is a good way for you to be able to do the mental math. If I'm at 90% chance to crit, I'm getting 90% of my critical strike damage bonus, right? This kind of general idea. But to be able to add this into our bucket right here for our additive bucket, let's go ahead and add on the total chance that we expect this to apply multiplied by the number that we got. So now I have a whopping 15.546. And if I were to take this number and I were to just copy over just the value, and I would also remove this part of the equation just very quickly, just so I can see what the original number was. It was 14.096. So we go ahead and paste this down here, just the value as well, right? But I'll go ahead and I'll add this back on, plus this, which is our 100% chance of proccing this additive bonus. We'll just add that into our bucket. We'll continue to increase that formula as we go. But let's go ahead and figure out what percentage of an increase this is, right? Because there should be 145% damage, but just as we learned from the intelligence multiplier, that's not really representative of what it is. Be able to figure out what this number was, right? We take the new number minus the old number. Luckily, we already have it over here, so we don't have to go through all of that rigmarole, but we just go ahead and we take this and we divide it by what our original number was. We multiply it by 100, just so you can see what that damage increase is. And this is a whopping 10% increase in our overall damage. That's right. The 145 additive crit damage that we had on our build, just according to the other stats that I've currently calculated right now, is representative of a 10% increase in damage. And remember, how much of a total increase in damage this will continue to get smaller and smaller and smaller the moment that I add my vulnerable damage, or if I have other additive damage sources that are relevant to what we're doing, like damage to close or damage to far, etc., etc. But right now, 145 additive damage on our build represents a 1.1 multiplier. I also went and changed over column L here to be status multi, and what I mean by that is I have successfully crit, so I now have a 50% damage multiplier here. 1 plus our 50% gets us a 1.5 multiplier. We'll also put other numbers here if we assume that we have 100% uptime on them. To be able to do this in another way too, so again, like let's say that this was 0.8 instead. You notice how this actually changes my additive number, but let's say that this was 0.8 instead. What we could actually do is take our expected multiplier, and we'll just say that this was like our expected multiplier of the 1.5, and it would actually be multiplied by our expected chance to be able to activate that multiplier. So if we had 80% chance to crit, that means that our 50% damage increase from successfully critting is only actually representative of a 20% increase in damage. Again, just as an example, we don't have to do it that way, and I'm not going to, but that is a way that you could represent those numbers. Now let's go ahead and look at Overpower. We are basically going to ignore it for the purposes of this example because we aren't actually successfully overpowering on this build more than the base chance or expected chance of this occurring, which would be 3%. So we would expect Overpower to land 0.03% of the time, and then we would add in our Overpower additive as well to our overall additive to be able to get to that number. And we would also add another 1.5 multiplier, but it would be a 1.5 multiplier multiplied by our expect chance to be able to trigger it. And that would get us a whopping 0.045% increase in damage while ignoring the multiplier. So again, we're not going to include this. In fact, we're just going to delete the column in general. But for people who are expecting to overpower, you need to calculate how often you're overpowering. So a really good example of this would be something like Bloodlance. For Bloodlance, we are expected to, if we're using Supernatural Bloodlance, to overpower every 7th cast of Bloodlance. So that means 1 out of 7. For 6 casts, you don't expect to overpower. For 7 casts, you do. So you have a 100% chance to overpower. If you want to get average damage, you would divide it by 7 because you only expect to overpower once every 7 casts. Obviously, this becomes different with a couple different things. One, Rathma's Vigor is also going to increase how often you overpower, and you can overpower multiple times during those total 7 casts. Then there are also some interesting interactions where using Hungry Blood and also using Gore Quills to be able to trigger an additional cast of Bloodlance on the last cast of your rotation actually speed you up by 1, which is kind of interesting. And they can both overlap, so you can actually double speed up your overlapping like overpower procs. Very, very weird interactions, or at least those existed in season 2. You're not here to learn about that, but for your overpowering builds, what you need to see is how often do you expect to overpower, and then get a rough estimate of that coefficient. Another great example would be something like Banished Lord's Talisman. Let's say that you could get up to 275 total max essence on a Bone Spirit build and then use Banished Lord's Talisman. It's actually a lot harder to do in season 4. But that being said, you can effectively do this. What that means is that you would cast Bone Spirit with 275 essence. You would successfully trigger Banished Lord's Talisman, which would say that you would overpower on your next cast. What that means is that you expect to overpower once every other cast, meaning once every 2 casts or 50% of the time. So you could take your 50% of the time expected chance of triggering Overpower and roughly add on the 3% chance that you're just expected to do it all the time. That's not actually how the statistics of it would work, since you can't guarantee an Overpower and also hit the 3% overpower. Like those two things could technically happen simultaneously, but for your purposes, you could just say you have a 53% chance of overpowering, meaning that you expect to get 53% of the total bonus of the 1.5, and then 53% of the expected additive from your overpower. Another reason why understanding this is actually so powerful is because you know that you could do setup with Banished Lord's Talisman to mean that before you walk up to a boss, you have already successfully triggered it and you will overpower on your next core skill cast, meaning that if you're expecting to one-shot the boss, you actually have 100% of your bonus of overpower since you know it's going to happen and you're expecting to kill them in a single shot. In that case, to do these same damage calculations, you would assume 100% bonus of your total overpower, multipliers, additive, and the actual main 1.5% bonus crit on itself. So that was too much, but I just want to include that for people who were like, hey, what about me? Like, how am I going to get included in this? That's how you would do that type of math. But since we don't need to include this, let's go ahead and delete this column. Now let's go ahead and talk about vulnerability. For this build, we're going to equally assume that we have 100% uptime on vulnerable on the targets when that is relevant for us. The reason why we have this is because we're both using corpse tendrils, which applies vulnerable, as well as bone prison, which on demand without any corpses applies vulnerable for 8 seconds. These two things overlapping means that we will always have vulnerable if we want to have vulnerable. So we get the full benefit of vulnerability. Again, since it's 100%, to get that down to an integer, we divide by 100. So we have a value of 1 for vulnerable. I can also get rid of the overpower additive here. And then we need to go figure out how much vulnerable additive damage that we have. Luckily for us, at least for the purposes of this example, we do not currently have any sources of vulnerable damage on the character. And the reason why that is because we already have 100% crit chance, and we can just get things that say straight up, your bone spirit does more damage. In these circumstances, what we can say is that since we already have multiple 100% effective uptime versions of multipliers and additive damage sources, we don't need to seek out vulnerable additive damage like you used to do back in the day. So vulnerable just represents a 20% increase in our overall damage, since vulnerable is a 1.2 multiplier if you successfully meet the requirements of having vulnerable on the target. So here, since we have a status multiplier of vulnerable, and that is 1.2 or a 20% increase, we just add that 1 plus our 20% right here. Bada bing, bada boom. We go ahead and add on a 0 for vulnerable damage here. And if we really wanted to keep this consistent, what we would then do is we would add our total of expected uptime multiplied by our expected additive damage here. And we would get nothing, because 1 times 0 is in fact 0. So now that we have those numbers there, we can get a total status multiplier. And what I mean by this is we are successfully critting, we are successfully applying vulnerable. What we need to get to is a total final multiplier of what that number represents. And that's actually very easy. What you would just do is you would take, and we're going to do our damage calculation here again. What you would do is you would take your base damage multiplied by your skill damage here, multiplied by the bone spirit essence multiplier, multiplied by our additive, multiplied by our intelligence, multiplied by our 1.5 from critting, and multiplied by our 1.2 from vulnerable. And now we're getting up to a whopping boop, 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 boop. We are now up to a whopping 6,556,869. Pretty big increase, right? Overall, we basically added 6 times our base damage there before. But what you'll notice is, at least from like these small things like the critical strike additive and these relatively small multipliers here, we aren't all of a sudden shooting through the roof, right? We need to add a lot more multipliers to this build. But what I hope you would be really keen on noticing here is the fact that continuing to add to our additive bucket is going to net us less and less and less here, because it's already a hyper saturated bucket, and we need new multipliers, not merely increasing multipliers that we already have. But now let's go ahead and talk about the different multipliers that we have from our aspects. These aren't in their own bucket. It's not like aspect multipliers are their own damage bucket here, but I just think it's very easy for people to conceptualize of the gear that they have, because it's very easy to read gear like Serration gives me an 80% damage increase, right? That's very simple. It's 1 plus 80% of our damage. I should expect to multiply my damage by 1.8. And that's exactly what you do. That's representative of nearly a 2 times damage multiplier. So let me go ahead and catalog all of the damage multipliers that I have from my gear, just to give an example of what that all looks like together. So for Serration, we have an 8% increase. That's a 1.8 times multiplier. From our amulet with Grasping Veins, we have a 75% increase. So this is a 1.75 times multiplier. And then since I'm using Plunging Darkness on my ring, so that when I use Bone Prison, it casts Blight. And on Blight, I have the 20% damage multiplier from that triggered ability. That is an additional 1.2 times multiplier. All right, great. We now just got ourselves a bunch of big numbers here, right? We got a ton of additional multipliers. Basically, all of them are higher than even my crit or vulnerable multiplier here. So to get our damage that we had previously, and what we're going to get now, we now are sitting at a whopping total of this times this times this times this times this, multiplied by our different statuses, multiplied by Serration and Grasping Veins and the Plunging Darkness. And we are now looking at a real big number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're now sitting pretty at a whopping 24.784 million damage. 24 million damage just from 3 aspects on our gear. Went from 6 mil to 24 million. That's the power of multipliers there, baby. But now let's go ahead and look at our skill tree, because our skill tree also represents a huge amount of additional multipliers for our build. For Bone Spirit, there are a couple of huge multipliers. You can typically get these ranks on your amulet. These are all passive multipliers of our damage here, but we can start to get an idea of just how big these numbers are, right? For Imperfectly Balance, our core skills are going to cost 21% more essence. That actually doesn't impact Bone Spirit's cost at all, but gives us a new 1.35 multiplier, or a 35% increase in our damage. Compound Fracture says that if you successfully crit 10 times, over the past 5 seconds, your bone skills now deal an additional 15% damage. Evulsion says that if you successfully crit against a target that is vulnerable, your bone skills gain a 25% damage multiplier. Here is a really good example of that thing I was talking about before. You both have to successfully crit and successfully apply vulnerable to the target to even benefit from this evulsion. So if you only had a 50% chance to crit and you can only apply vulnerable about 50% of the time, that means that evulsion for you is actually only a quarter effective. But since we have a 100% chance to crit and we can apply vulnerable on demand, we get the full benefit of Evulsion's multi here. So let me go ahead and add those into the table. So for Evulsion, it's a 1.25 multi. For Compound Fracture, which is really easy to trigger by using Bone Storm, which is a bone skill which can crit and hits twice per second. Just keep that in mind, a 1.15. And then we're going to add on our Imperfectly Balanced, which is another 1.35. But that's not all. We also have things like Death's Embrace, which says that if we are close to the target, which Bone Spirit typically likes to shotgun into them, that you're going to deal an additional 6% damage. So that's a 1.06, a little guy there. Then in addition to that, we also have Amplified Damage. If we successfully curse a target with Decrepify, we gain another 12% damage multiplier. So that's a 1.12. Easy peasy. I'm just going to double check to make sure there's nothing else on here. Nope, nothing else. Those are the damage multipliers that are currently available to us. If I really wanted to, the aspect multiplier here, which was speaking to Blight and its ability to apply a 1.2, I could technically tabulate it here. It doesn't matter where it happens in the calculation. Because it turns out, it doesn't matter when you multiply a thing by something. If you multiply it by 2 and then multiply it by 3, it's the exact same thing as multiplying it by 3 and then multiplying it by 2. Where you apply a multiplier, as long as it's happening to the equation overall, like every single number is being multiplied together, doesn't matter when it happens. Similarly, doesn't matter when you divide those numbers either. But now that we have this, let's go ahead and look at our damage. I should just be leaving these along. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do that. So here our base damage was basically just, our this multiplied by our skill. Great. And then here, adding it on, we then take this number and then also multiply that by our multiplier. I'm just going to drag this across and we'll just keep doing this little exercise here. This would be equal to this multiplied by our additive bucket. This would be equal to this multiplied by our int multi. This is equal to this multiplied by our, let's see, status multis. We're going to get rid of these ones. This was equal to this multiplied by our aspects. Boop, boop, boop. Great. This will be equal to this number, that 24 million damage. Glad that the math worked out again, multiplied by all of the multipliers from our skill tree. And adding on all of our different skill multipliers now gets us up to a whopping 57 million damage with a little bit of chump change left over. But that's not all. That's not the only things that we got going for us right now. Let's go ahead and look at the multipliers that we get from our Paragon nodes. Luckily for us, Paragon nodes are like pretty simple to do the math of. Things like Sacrificial say that you just do 10% additional damage. That's just another 1.1 multiplier. Amplify Damage says that you do 10% more damage to cursed targets. That's a 1.1 multiplier. Corporeal says that I do 10% more damage with physical damage. That's a 1.1 multiplier. Essence says that as long as the monster isn't healthy, I now gain an additional 22% critical strike damage multiplier. So that means if the first Bone Spirit don't kill it, the second Bone Spirit is going to go ahead and whop it with a big old 1.22. For the purposes of our equation here, we could just consider this 50% effective, considering you need to not one-shot them and then hit them again. That being said, there's a lot that goes into how often a monster is or is not healthy. Do I need to hit them with 5 bone spirits to kill them, like a level 200 Uber boss? Then I have 4 out of 5 of those, or an 80% uptime on my 22% multi. For our purposes, I'm just going to keep it at 22% multi, but understand that this also does have some prerequisite that you have to meet to be able to activate it. And then Scourge says that if a target is affected by shadow damage over time, like when we use Plunging Darkness Bone Prison to be able to trigger Blight on a target, we get another 1.1 multi. Not of your shadow damage, just of your damage overall. This is a really cheeky tech that I basically have tried to include on the vast majority of builds because it's just awesome when you get to land this thing on stuff, and it is significantly more powerful than people give it credit for. And then the last thing here is Scent of Death. This build is not really a corpse-based build. Yes, we do generate corpses to be able to use corpse tendrils, but when you come walking up to a boss, they don't have corpses around them. So Scent of Death says that you also get another 15% or 1.15 multiplier of your overall damage. So when I go ahead and add all those together, we get 1.1 from Scourge. We're going to gain the 1.15 from Scent of Death. We're going to gain the 1.22 from the Essence Glyph. We're going to gain another 1.1 from Amplify, a 1.1 from Corporeal, a 1.1 from Sacrificial. The last thing that I didn't point out is that Bone Graph says that every single time that you hit a target, not only are you going to gain maximum essence, but you're also going to gain a damage multiplier up to a whopping 8% of additional damage. And again, Bone Storm applies that in 4 seconds. So we generally can expect to have Bone Graph up at maximum capacity all the time. So that's another 1.08 multiplier here. Let's go ahead and look at what the damage looks like now. So we're going to take our last number and we're going to multiply by this, and then 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 this. Bam. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9-digit damage. We're doing 126 million damage with our Bone Spirit now. Pretty big increases in damage. If you remember how much of an increase our additive damage bucket was, it was pretty significant, right? Because this represented a 15 times total multi. But just to give you an idea, I'm just going to take these multipliers and put them together because all these are significantly smaller, right? Like 15 times multi over here versus like a 1.5 multi over here. But what do all of these multipliers mean together? So it's 1 times this times this times this times this times this times this times this, etc., etc. This is like the worst ASMR in the history of ASMR. These multipliers put together over here, even when the small ones, the 10% increase, the 15% increase, the 6% increase, the 8% increase, is representative of a 34.7 times total damage multiplier on your build. These little things add up, and the more of them that you can put on, the better, because each one is a whole new multiplier of your damage. It's not diluted by any other ones. Adding on a 1.8 multi here does not diminish the benefit of a 1.75 multiplier over here. Putting on a 1.06 multi here doesn't diminish the 22% damage multiplier over here. They're just whole new multipliers of your overall damage, as opposed to things which end up in your bucket, the additive bucket. So this is why adding more multipliers onto your character can significantly outperform even huge amounts of additive damage over here. So when we start looking at stats like 12.5 bone damage, maybe it's not worth even the 2 Paragon points that would take you to get over to here. This 1 willpower node, which would do nothing for your damage, and this 1 bone damage node, which means that since it took 2 Paragon nodes, you're actually only getting 6.25 additive damage per Paragon node here. Maybe pathing over to this extra little bit of damage on your board will not actually lead to an increase that having those extra points would allow you to path over to another legendary node or path over to another glyph, etc. I don't want to delve too deeply into this topic because I do kind of just want to make a whole video just about Paragon, because I also want to teach people like how to path through it and how to make good decisions, etc. Because I think it'll be even more important in this season than it ever was before, except for maybe the Abattoir of Zir. But there you go. I wanted to walk people through how you can sit down and do the mental math, the mental gymnastics to figure out how beneficial is it to put an aspect on your two-hander versus put an aspect on your amulet versus put an aspect on your gloves versus make different decisions in your Paragon tree, or prioritize additive damage, or prioritize main stat like intelligence, or maybe make sure to prioritize getting additional passive stat skills, which would be incredibly large overall multipliers of your damage inside of your skill tree, as opposed to a measly 75 additive crit damage here. Now, this doesn't mean that any one of these stats is useless, right? If you put a stat on that says damage that you deal goes up, your damage is going to go up. But what's important to do is the analysis of one option versus another option. If you learned something here, if you're new, if you're a returning viewer and you never have before, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It would mean the world to me. It would be really nice to see the channel continue to grow throughout the year, especially as Diablo is back on the brains of the majority of players who are excited for this season walking up. And if you like the video, go ahead and toss a like on it. That helps YouTube to know that it should show it off to more nerds who may benefit from this type of information. If you had any questions, comments, concerns, think my math is faulty, had a different understanding, or would like some more clarification, go ahead and comment down below as well. I'll try to answer all of your questions whenever I possibly can. I would just like to say kind of upfront, this isn't like my understanding or like my idea of how this works. This is just how the math works. So if you're running across things where you're like, oh, I thought only this thing worked like this, I'm probably going to clarify to you that like, no, that is not how it works. But if you had questions that were leading to a confusion, that's where I'll be able to help you out. Thank you very much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps for you to be able to make the best informed decisions walking into season 4 as you possibly can. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next video.